Chapter 2. Symptomatic readings. As the doctor boards the derelict ship early in Hodgson's story, he remarks on the peculiar smell it emits. I felt that in some way, it was vaguely familiar, yet I could give it no name. The derelict, pages 35 to 6. His inability to place the smell disturbs him so much that he recurs to it. There was again a vague odor of something half familiar, that somehow brought to me a sense of half-known fright. P39. It is not the odor itself that frightens him so much, perhaps, as its incomplete familiarity. It stirs in him a memory of something he cannot quite bring to mind. Similarly, upon Prentic's first meeting with Emling, one of Moreau's beast people, he comments on the haunting sense of déjà vu with which Emling inspires him. I had never beheld such an extraordinary and repulsive face before, and yet if the contradiction is credible, I experienced at the same time an odd feeling that in some way I had encountered exactly the features and gestures that now amazed me. The Island of Dr. Moreau, P11, emphasis in text. The boy could be in Hodgson's The Adventure of the Headland, hunted by strange dogs somewhere on the African coast, hears the baying of the pack that pursues him, and for the second time the big yet frightening familiarity of it stirred the boy's memory oddly. P184. The uncanny. Sigmund Freud attempts to account for precisely such a sensation in his essay The Uncanny. The uncanny, he writes, is that which arouses dread and creeping horror, akin to and yet distinct from that which is fearful, P122, and thus the sensation of uncanniness is not a response to an object or event that is simply strange and unknown. Instead, the uncanny is that class of the terrifying which leads us back to something long known to us, once very familiar, pages 123 to 4. The uncanny object is simultaneously Heimlich and unheimlich, familiar and unfamiliar. It violates a crucial binarism by which we organize the world. In the terms I have outlined above, the sensation of uncanniness is a symptomatic response to liminal phenomena, which confound and exceed the classificatory systems designed to contain matter. The anomaly has no proper form, by crossing the borders that separate one category from another, by occupying two categories at once. The anomaly familiarizes both. Emling presents the spectacle of the animal become human, or the human become animal, as do the dogs in Adventure of the Headland, whose numbers include certain regressed humans who run and bay with the pack and hunt human flesh. The doctor cannot initially recognize that the smell of the derelict has something animal-like in it, P41, because the familiar smell is inappropriate, defamiliarized by the improper context. Thus far the sensation of the uncanny bears a strong similarity to that of the hesitation described by Todorov, the symptomatic response to an anomalous phenomenon, a supernatural event, situated within an inappropriate context, the natural setting. Freud, however, is careful to distinguish the sensation of the uncanny from that of intellectual uncertainty, P124, or metaphysical estrangement. The symptom, for Freud, redounds upon the subject who experiences it, denoting resistance or refusal on the part of the subject. The object of uncanniness is something familiar and old established in the mind that has been estranged only by the process of repression. P148. It is Heimlich within the occluded level of the unconscious, unheimlich to the conscious mind. Uncanniness constitutes a moment of near rupture, wherein the repressed contents of the unconscious struggle to come to the surface and are repressed again. The Freudian uncanny, then, draws into intimate relation the subject, who incurs the symptom, and the object which inspires it. That the relation is one of likeness one's clearest in Moreau, where the distinction between these people and fully human characters like Prentic is constantly in danger of collapse at a highly visible textual level. Prentic confronts half-humanness, but he cannot quite comprehend it. As such, he finds Emling uncanny. The symptom compromises him as one who recognizes, but then denies, the possibility of his own half-humanness. The scenario Freud finds most conducive to uncanniness one's that which recalls the trauma of Oedipality, whereby desire for the mother was foreclosed by the threat of castration by the father. Point 3. He does, however, briefly consider the uncanny in relation to pre-Oedipality, a time when the ego was not yet sharply differentiated from the external world and from other persons, P143.4. Anything which threatens to dissolve the boundaries the ego has erected to distinguish itself from other people, other things. Freud's example is the figure of the doppelganger, provokes in the subject a half-recollection of this period of amorphous identity. The doctor's sensation of uncanniness in the derelict, then, is multivalenced. It is a symptomatic response to the anomalous nature of the slime mold entity, but it also pulls him within the field of indifferentiation, or thingness, that the entity represents degree. This dynamic is still more evident in Hodgson's The Thing in the Weeds, which describes yet another seagoing encounter with a slimy-bodied monstrosity. The narrator comments on the thing's smell, faint and sickly, yet vaguely suggestive of something I had once smelled before, P60. Later the indefinable familiarity of the smell, P61, is traced to the stench of rotting human bodies. The first mate jokes that I'm thinking it's Davy Jones come up for a breather, P61, and recalls smelling a similar odor when he once boarded a derelict ship full of dead men, P62. The uncanniness of the thing's smell speaks to a fact the narrator would rather not remember, that he, too, is a thing, circumscribed wholly within the materiality of human embodiedness. Objection. Prentic finds Emling uncanny, but the emotion is also tinged with disgust. Later on he tells Montgomery that it gives me a nasty little sensation, a tightening of my muscles, when he comes near me, P35. In Disgust and Other Forms of Aversion, David Pohl argues that in order to disgust, disgusting objects must fulfill two conditions. The first is liminality registered. Nothing is more fearfully disturbing than experiences that seem to call in doubt the whole scheme of known distinctions by which we live, P227. This alone, however, cannot account for the intensity of the affect of disgust, nor for the essential ambivalence of an emotion compounded of both aversion and desire, revulsion and fascination. What is lacking is some element of self-identification that makes the horrifying thing also a part of me, P227. Pohl, whose field is the philosophy of aesthetics, does not discuss the mechanisms of resistance, which might block the disgusted subject's recognition of its likeness to the disgusting object, and thus aggravate the intensity of the affect. The Freudian uncanny, however, allows us to identify Prentick's disgust as symptomatic of a particularly violent denial of his doubling relationship with Emling, as a particularly intense version of the recognition/repression dynamic of uncanniness. I will return to the issue of disgust shortly, but I wish for the moment to remain with Freud's hint that a doubling relationship, which on the surface accomplishes a simple bifurcation of the self, gestures towards a more radical physioning of the self towards an amorphous version of the self which is a non-self, because it has forfeited all the boundaries that enabled it to distinguish itself from the world of things that surround it. Stevenson makes a similar gesture in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Jekyll's researches bring him steadily nearer to that truth that man is not truly one, but truly two, and his potion allows him to literalize the truth of a bifurcated subjectivity through a doubling of bodies. But Jekyll qualifies his assertion. I say two, because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Others will follow, others will outstrip me on the same lines, and I hazard to guess that man will be ultimately known for a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous and independent denizens. P 104.7. This gesture undoes the most basic and readily accessible interpretation of Jekyll and Hyde, that it stages a confrontation between good and evil. The human being embroiled within such a Monty Chean drama is split into, but nonetheless fully situated within the field of meaningfulness, wherein meaning arises through the constant and steady tension between terms fixed in an oppositional relation one to the other. But to be a multiple subject not simply split, but fractured, dissolved is to spin out of the field, and thus to be evacuated of a meaningful self-identity. The derelict completes the gesture by representing a human subject who has lost all specificity whatsoever. O.M. Harrison becomes a glob of undifferentiated matter, indistinguishable from the undifferentiated material world that has engulfed him. This repulsive yet intriguing possibility of loss of self-identity is the topic of Julia Kristova's Powers of Horror, an essay on abjection. Abjection, for Kristeva, is a nauseating affective state, like ambivalence but more racking, more violent than the sensation of uncanniness, too primordial to be called an emotion, for it refers back to the affective state of the self before it has become a self. During pre-adipality, Kristeva argues, the not yet subject experiences itself simply as a body crossed by drives, a body, moreover, which has not yet identified itself as a discrete entity registered, but rather experiences itself as continuous with all other things in its field. This proto-subject, then, occupies a space which is a chaos, not yet brought to order by the signifying systems, familial configurations, sexual difference, language, that structure the cultural order and determine one's place in it, not even yet provisionally ordered by the basic distinction me/not me. Abjection begins when this proto-subject, very tentatively, begins to clear out a space on which the ego will be constructed and from which an I will emerge. The moment is a terrifying one, recalling the trauma of birth, the immemorial violence with which a body becomes separated from another body in order to be P10. Nor does the ambivalent proto-subject, though impelled towards self-differentiation, wish to relinquish the state of being purely constituted by the fierce, directionless energies of the ID. Moreover, the attempt to empty out a space upon which to erect a self is an impossible one, for the objects that surround the proto-subject have not yet become distinguished as such as objects encounter distinction to an integral subjectivity, even before things for him are. Hence before they are signifiable he drives them out. P6, emphasis. In text, what the proto-subject drives out, then, is itself. In a moment of anguish, it throws up everything, P6, and by evacuating a world until this instant utterly continuous with itself, evacuates itself. I expel myself, I spit myself out, I object myself within the same motion through which I claim to establish myself. During that course in which I become, I give birth to myself amid the violence of sobs, a vomit, P3, emphasis in text. The primordial experience of abjection remains as a trace memory. Long after the proto-subject has constituted itself as a full, discrete and integral subject, not a repressed memory, because the experience occurred before the creation of the unconscious, but rather a body memory of nausea and convulsion. This memory can be triggered by confrontation with anomalous phenomena, objects or events which spill over the lines of demarcation meant to contain them, and thus call into question the permanence and efficacy of any boundaries, most notably those erected by the self to maintain itself as a distinct entity. It is thus not lack of cleanliness that causes abjection, but what disturbs identity, system, order. What does not respect borders, positions, rules, the in-between, the ambiguous, the composite, P4. Abjection draws me toward the place where meaning collapses, P2, and where the self, too, dissolves into indifferentiation and meaninglessness. The crucial point for Kristeva is that the symptom of nausea does not denote a repression, but something quite different. Abjection, albeit nauseating, is a fundamentally ambivalent affective state. The object is a vortex of summons and repulsion. It simultaneously besieges and pulverizes the subject. Pages 1, 5. The subject confronting the object is torn between two ontological possibilities, one which is rigidly invested in the construct of a stable self-identity, one which is attracted to the turbulence, chaos, and indifferentiation associated with pre-adipality. In the experience of abjection one can have it both ways. Abjection is a joggersence in which the subject is swallowed up but in which the other, the object, in return, keeps the subject from foundering by making it repugnant. P9. The subject is dissolved, but in the convulsions of nausea its body boundaries, at least, are remade. One thus understands why so many victims of the object are its fascinated victims. P9. Nausea. What I am moving towards here, slowly, are speculations as to why the readers of the Findistical Gothic were, and are, its fascinated victims. What can account for the phenomenal popularity of what was, with few exceptions, a thoroughly nauseating genre? For there are two things that Findistical Gothic represents again and again. The first is the spectacle of the human subject undergoing dissolution, a spectacle which provokes hysterical anxiety in Sartre's analysis, a sense of metaphysical estrangement in Todorov's, repression and denial in Freud's, abjection in Kristova's. The second one's the symptom of nausea. From Dracula, as the Count leaned over me and his hands touched me. I could not repress a shudder. It may have been that his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me, which, do what I would, I could not conceal. Pages 28 to 9. From Jekyll and Hyde, Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. These were points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing, and fear with which Utterson regarded him. P. 52. From Conan Doyle's Lot. 249. The features of the mummy, though horribly discolored, were perfect, and two little nub-like eyes still lurked in the depths of the black, hollow sockets. In its crouching position, with bent joints and craned head, there was a suggestion of energy about the horrid thing, which made Smith's gorge rise. P. 84. From the three impostors, I stood shuddering and quaking as with the grip of ague, sick with unspeakable agonies of fear and loathing. P. 324. From Guy Boothby's Pharos the Egyptian, 1899, and the other Pharos turned his head and looked at me, and, as he did so, a great shudder, accompanied by an indescribable feeling of nausea, passed over me. Once more I experienced the same sensation of revulsion that had overwhelmed me twice before. Again I felt sick and giddy. Once more a clammy sweat broke out upon my forehead. Pages 27, 42. From Frank Aubrey's A Queen of Atlantis, A Romance of the Caribbean Sea, 1899. Most strange of all, a cold, sickly horror seized upon the two. It was a feeling of nausea such as might be caused by an aroma of intolerable foulness, and with it the sensation of repulsion and disgust that a human being has for a loathsome, unclean thing. Pages 77 to 8. These examples could be multiplied indefinitely. In its generation of an endless procession of abhuman embodiments, the Findus Regal Gothic dictates, as the proper somatic response to abhumanness, the sensation of disgust. Pohl writes that disgust, being contagious, contaminates its subject as well. P. 221. That is, the subject is compromised by its confrontation with the disgusting object, drawn into the field of its thingness, an analysis consistent with both Sartre and Kristeva. It is by no means a given that a reader's affective state must correspond to that of the text's characters, but characterly nausea offers at least a strong suggestion as to how the reader should respond. As D. A. Miller writes of a genre invoked several decades before the Gothic, the Victorian sensation novel. It offers us one of the first instances of modern literature to address itself primarily to the sympathetic nervous system, where it grounds its characteristic adrenaline effects, accelerated heart rate and respiration, increased blood pressure, the pallor resulting from vasoconstriction, and so on. The sensation text can mobilize the reader's sympathetic nervous system only by giving it something to sympathize with. In order to make us nervous, nervousness must first be represented. 3. In order to make us nauseous, nausea must first be represented. That characterly nausea is always in danger of spilling over the boundaries of the text and infecting the reader is most startlingly apparent in this quote from Hodgson's The Boats of the Glencarrig: "Now it is scarcely possible to convey the extraordinary disgust which the sight of these human slugs bred in me, nor could I, do I think I would, for were I then successful, then would others be like to retch even as I did, the spasm coming on without premonition, and born of very horror." Pages 69 to 70. Hysteria. One evening, however, after Rachel had come home, her mother heard a noise, which sounded like suppressed weeping in the girl's room, and on going in, found her lying, half undressed, upon the bed, evidently in the greatest distress. As soon as she saw her mother, she exclaimed, "Ah, mother, why did you let me go to the forest with Helen?" Mrs. M was astonished at so strange a question, and proceeded to make inquiries. Rachel told her a wild story. She said. Clark closed the book with a snap. Mackin, the Great God Pan, p. 187. In the passage from the Boats of the Glencarrig cited on p. 45 above, Hodgson deploys a rhetorical strategy typical of the fin de siècle Gothic, a simultaneous movement towards, and convulsive retreat from, the representation of horrific bodily realities. Here the strategy is a specious one. The narrator's talk of rushing does indeed convey his extraordinary disgust to the reader, but elsewhere in Glencarrig the strategy is used more urgently, as the narrative oscillates between graphic depictions of abhuman and other monstrosities and a refusal to describe them. The text itself, in other words, is rent by the same irresolvable ambivalence as Christopher's abject subject, in the throes of both desire and loathing for the prospect of an abhuman becoming. They must be men of very cold imagination, writes Anne Radcliffe in her 1826 on the supernatural in poetry, with whom certainty is more terrible than surmise, p. 149. Working from Edmund Burke's 1756 A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, Radcliffe distinguishes between the dramatic effect of terror, characterized by uncertainty and obscurity respecting the dreaded evil, and horror, which results from the graphic depiction of the dreaded evil. Horror, for Radcliffe, is the debased emotion, or the cheap literary effect, whereas terror, which exalts and uplifts, is a proper source of the sublime. Terror and horror are so far opposite, that the first expands the soul, and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life, and the other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them, p. 149. In The Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, Radcliffe sublime and terrible landscapes, described in Burkean terms of majestic obscurity, both correspond to and intensify the powerful but indefinite apprehensions of the mind. As she travels towards Montoni's castle, Emily St. Aubert, oppressed by vague fears of the perils that await her, is aroused by the alpine scenery into a sense of dreadful sublimity, the gloomy grandeur of the forests, and the tremendous precipices of the mountains, that came partially to the eye, each assisted to raise the solemnity of Emily's feelings into awe, pages 224 to 5. This passage of sublime terror derives its effect, in Burkean fashion, from uncertainty. The uncertain outlines of an immense and overpowering landscape, the Uncertainties of a mind in turmoil and might be contrasted to the horrid conclusion of Matthew Lewis the Monk, 1796. Nothing is left to the reader's imagination in the scene as Ambrosio's still living body once shattered upon the rocks and mutilated by insects and birds of prey. Here, one finds no vague apprehensions or dimly perceived threats, only graphic certainties. A novel like The Great God Pan, seemingly, deploys literary techniques, of which Radcliffe would approve, until the very end shrouding its dreaded evil, the abhuman Helen Vaughan, from view of the reader. By means of obfuscating rhetoric, the multiplication and confusion of narrative layers, and constant interruption of the story being told, even in the graphic portrayal of Helen's deliquescing body, the text cannot specify the exact nature of her metamorphosis, and hints at worse horrors than those found on the page. Here the miscues illegible. A. Seen midway through the text, when Villers gives Austen a neat little packet of manuscript containing fan account of the entertainment Mrs. Beaumont aka Helen Vaughan provided for her choicer guests, is typical. Austen took the manuscript, but never read it. Opening the neat pages at haphazard, his eye was caught by a word and a phrase that followed it, and, sick at heart, with white lips and a cold sweat pouring like water from his temples, he flung the paper down. p. 231. Villers, who has read the manuscript through, says, I can fancy what you saw. Such forces cannot be named, cannot be spoken, cannot be imagined except under a veil and a symbol. Pages 231 to 2, a speech which causes Austen to break out into a cold sweat again. The reader learns no more of what was written. Despite such strategies of narrative occlusion, practiced consistently throughout The Great God Pan, the novel hardly makes an approach towards the sublime. Here the result of textual indefinition is not to expand the soul, to quote Radcliffe again, but to contract the faculties into the visceral response of nausea. 5. Clearly the textual mechanisms which work to produce a nauseating affect are more complicated than those allowed for within Radcliffe, and in fact they bear striking similarities to those described within another Findysical discourse, early psychoanalysis, the mechanisms of hysteria, which work to produce symptoms across the body of the traumatized subject, at precisely the point where The Great God Pan might give specifics, rather than the vague effusions about nameless horrors it has offered so far. It interrupts itself, inserting instead the specifics of Austen's nauseated response to the story of Helen Vaughan, his sickness, pallor, and sweat. It then resorts to more obfuscating rhetoric, as Villers speaks at great length registered about how what Helen is, what Helen does, is unspeakable. The trauma Helen represents is absolutely central to the novel manuscript. After manuscript masses itself around that center, and yet the novel will not, or cannot, say what the trauma is. Instead the novel erupts into symptoms, as one character after another succumbs to nausea, and more language is produced. I am reading an excess of language as itself symptomatic. To identify the trauma as one that exceeds language, to assert that something is too horrible to be spoken of, is the privileged utterance of the Gothic, but at once also the privileged utterance of the hysteric. Freud argues that the precondition of hysteria is a disturbance in the sphere of sexuality, Dora, p. 39, so intolerable that it must be repressed. The memory escapes to the unconscious, and thus is henceforth incapable of expression in conventional discourse. The forces of repression at work ensure its unspeakability. But that which the conscious mind cannot acknowledge, and the subject cannot speak, the body tells instead, resulting in what Freud called conversion into any number of hysterical symptoms, including paralysis, enervation, nervous twitchings, dyspnoea, and finally, nausea. The Great God Pan, like other texts within its genre, responds to the traumatic and intolerable prospect of the loss of human specificity registered by becoming hysterical. Over and again the novel recurs to its site of disturbance, and over and again it marks its own inability to frame abhumanness within the available language Clarke tried to conceive. The thing again and again his mind shuddered and shrank back, appalled before the sight of such awful, unspeakable elements enthroned, as it were, and triumphant in human flesh. p. 188. Nor can conventional narrative structures contain abhumanness. The novel is comprised of a confusing mass of interlocking stories, all of which circle around the indescribable phenomenon of Helen Vaughan, all of which interrupt themselves and one another and will not conclude. Narrators suffer aphasia and breakdown. The text and its interpolated texts are ruptured by narrative gaps, elicions, and outright refusals. There is a compulsion to represent, as the almost obsessive proliferation of interpolated manuscripts indicates, but at the same time the novel abjures utterance. However, The Great God Pan deploys quite precise language in detailing the hysterical symptoms of its narrators and readers, particularly, as in the description of Austen's cold sweat, the symptom of nausea. Symptoms manifest themselves across multiple bodies, as if the thingness of Helen Vaughan were so overwhelming that it could not be expressed through a single displacement, through the hystericization of a single body. A ripple effect of revulsion emanates from without the unspecifiably disgusting body of Helen Vaughan, infecting even the most casual observer. Everyone who saw her at the police court said she was at once the most beautiful woman and the most repulsive they had ever set eyes on. I have spoken to a man who saw her, and I assure you he positively shuddered as he tried to describe the woman, but he couldn't say what. Pages 198 to 9. Helen Vaughan's immediate victims, her husband, her lovers, the girl Rachel, are more fatally hystericized and die of lingering nervous disorders, from sudden heart failure, or from suicide. Hysterization also operates at one remove from Helen's presence, through, for example, the very bodies of Helen's victims, whose hysterical symptoms are catching. Villers says of Herbert, Helen's husband, there was something about the man that made one shiver. His presence seemed to chill one's blood. p. 201. Even the London townhouse in which Helen entertained her guest retains an ability to sicken. Villers, exploring the house, is overcome by dyspnoea, faintness, and nausea. After this incident, he says, I was in bed for a week, suffering from what my doctor called nervous shock and exhaustion, P203. The contagion of disgust spreads through and overwhelms the text. Second, remove hysteria, however, is chiefly triggered through reading. The great God Penn especially focuses on the nauseated responses of Clark, Villers, and Austin as they read through or are unable to read the series of undisclosed interpolated manuscripts. I will not make too much of this point, since such a scenario rarely occurs elsewhere in the Fin Gothic. Nonetheless, a dynamic which pertains generally across the genre is highly visible in this Mackin novel, that the Fin Gothic is training its readership somatically, underscoring that nausea is the proper response to a confrontation with abhumanness. Hystericized itself, the genre seeks to draw its reader into the field of its hysteria. Pleasure. The question remains as to why the reader would consent to be thus hystericized by the experience of reading. Certainly we enjoy texts that evoke a strong affect, but why this affect, the unpleasurable sensation of nausea? When I read Moreau as a 12-year-old, the novel sickened me. And thus I reread it many times more. 9. Perhaps I am the anomaly here. But perhaps not. Moreau's reviewers insisted, in the strongest possible language, that the novel was disgusting. The author, not content with the horror inevitable in his idea, has sought out revolting details with the zeal of a sanitary inspector probing a crowded graveyard. The Saturday Review. A New York ordinarily fastidious reader cannot but be repelled at some of the descriptions of the Beast People, the Academy. A more gruesomely grotesque and uncanny tale than the island of Dr. Moreau it would be hard to imagine, the critic. The horrors described by Mr. Wells in his latest book very pertinently raise the question how far it is legitimate to create feelings of disgust in a work of art, Athenaeum, degree. And yet Moreau was a rousing popular success, one of 2 novels that established Wells' reputation and fortune. Advertising for Frank Audrey's The Deviltry of El Dorado, 1896, a particularly densely plotted novel with many other sensational improbabilities to attract a readership, focused on the anthropophagus tree itself, and emphasized by way of recommendation the disgustingness of the tree. The gruesome deviltry is about as ghastly a horror as the most jaded appetite could wish. When once the nightmare of the tree makes its appearance, we are enthralled by the hideous fascination of a most ghastly tale. The idea of the tree is sufficiently blood-curdling to satisfy the most blasé amateur of the gruesome. For a description of the carnivorous monster we must refer our readers to Mr. Audrey's own pages, where, if they love to sup on horrors, we can assure them that they will find an ample meal. T.O. Crown all, the awful deviltry itself is a conception sufficiently ghastly and full of horror to satisfy the cravings of the most jaded intellectual appetite. Note how drastically, in the space of 7 years, the advertisement appeared in 1903, basic assumptions about the reader and his order desires have changed. Wells reviewers feel duty bound to warn away the ordinarily fastidious reader from Wells' nauseating Beast People. Audrey's advertisers worry that the reader, grown jaded, will not find the deviltry nauseating enough. It would seem that Fin readers were not only successfully trained to respond to Gothic texts with disgust, but also to like it. One critical model identifies horror genres as cathartic, providing a space wherein the reader temporarily may entertain certain illicit or intolerable possibilities represented by monstrosity, only to expel them, along with the text, when the monster is bested at the end. 23 Within this model, nausea the prelude to vomiting could be said strikingly to literalize, or somatize, the dynamic of catharsis. However, many Fin Gothic texts provide only partial closure or none at all. The infection of abhumanness spreads steadily, as it does in Moreau. Throughout the entire purview of the text, monstrosity is not expelled. Catharsis theory as well assumes a certain predictability on the part of the reader, straightforward mechanisms of identification, straightforward desire for closure and the reconstitution of normality and order. Audrey's reader, by contrast at least the ideal reader constructed by the advertisement, is more difficult to characterize, seemingly uninterested in plot or characterization, attracted by the prospect of chaos, craving the sensation of nausea for its own sake. This reader, in fact, emerges as startlingly hungry for disgust in the 3 reviews that speak of readerly appetite. The advertisement appeals to a reader both sophisticated, blasé, in palate and voracious, in search of an ample meal of disgustingness. Audrey's novel features a tree that eats people, and the reader eats it up. What mechanisms of identification are at work here? One must finally, I think, read the symptom of readerly nausea as a multivalenced one. Within the text, nausea draws the fully human character into intimate relation with abhumanness, as occurs with Prendick and Emling. The symptom signifies both metaphysical estrangement, as the boundaries that separated humans from things collapse, and denial, as Prendick fights to maintain the illusion, no longer tenable, of his own fully human identity. Across the text, nausea draws the fully human reader, as well, into intimate relation with abhumanness. Readerly nausea may be a symptom of denial, like Prendick's. Through this emphatic negation, visceral revulsion, the reader may refuse her place within the spectacle of the human becoming other, affirming her identity as a stable and integral human subject. For Kristeva, nausea allows one to maintain, in the most fragile sense possible, an identity of sorts not of the specular ego, unmade by abjection, but of the body ego, remade in the contractions of disgust. The Gothic, however, disallows even this, most tentative, identity construct, for it is precisely the human body that it reveals as phantasmic and changeful. But it does offer nausea. Nausea throws the subject back into the immediate and unmistakable experience of its own body, affording the subject concrete proof of its own reality, its own undeniable, material thingness, if not of its meaningfulness. As the outlines of the human body dissolve indeed, as the whole universe around it threatens to dissolve into thingness, the reader is consoled with bodily sensation, however fleeting, however nauseating. Or perhaps the reader is simply drawn towards the sickening vortex of abhumanness, towards not only the forces of turbulent disorder and indifferentiation, as Kristeva argues, but also the prospect of the terrible and thrilling reconfigurations of identity and meaning that may emerge from the vortex. Whether this is a strategy of identification, or something Else entirely, I cannot answer here.